Now I think you can understand why I was very unhappy to see that I had to follow David Whitman on the program. And on top of that, I have Gordon Kay. Tough acts to follow. You may know of a book called Time and Again by Jack Finney. It involves time travel and the mechanism Finney's protagonist, Cy Morley, uses to transport himself back in time was not some complicated gizmo or an old DeLorean, but by placing himself in a setting identical to what it was during the time period to which he wished to return, which in his case was New York City in 1882. Morley chose an apartment at the Dakota, that landmark building on Central Park West, which was essentially unchanged for more than a century. The right setting, some authentic props, a bit of meditation, and he was there. So here we are, members of the class of 1967, with a few others, of course, sitting in this chapel, which is essentially unchanged from what it was when we were here in the 1960s. Now imagine it's a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m., the regular required weekly meeting of the student body. Instead of me up here, picture Dean Winton Tolles, shirt tail partially hanging out, cigarette ashes on the lapel of his shapeless suit jacket, making an announcement that meets the approval of the student body. What you hear next is this. So join me, please, and we'll complete the circuit back. So welcome back. Not everyone liked the finger snapping. To some, it was a reflection of Hamilton cool, an effortless detachment, real or feigned, epitomized by someone who could roll to Skidmore twice a week, miss classes, and still pull down a pretty respectable grade point average. But I was quite taken by the finger snapping. It was as an alternative to clapping or foot stomping or the treble whooping that is the custom on college campuses today. This was no rah-rah school, like Colgate down the road. To me, the finger snapping was rather admirable, an understated, quiet self-confidence that defined Hamilton men of those years, both here and in the larger world. In retrospect, maybe it was a little of both. The class analyst who spoke from this podium the year we graduated was Louis Brockway, a New York advertising executive, and like me, a trustee of the college. Professor Maurice Isserman, who wrote the college history on the Hill, observed to me this winter that the college Brockway returned to in 1967 would have been quite familiar to him and his mates from the class of, get this guys, 1917. Certainly more so than is the Hamilton College of today to us. Physically, the core of the campus, centered on this chapel, remains the same. It was while we were here that the Bristol Campus Center was built. Bruce Sanford wrote about it approvingly in The Spectator as the living room of the campus, although it was quickly dubbed Stonehenge because of those archways on either side that have no apparent use. Bristol is no longer the Student Center. That's now the Sadov Center, which used to be the ELS House. Before that, the Student Center was Beinecke, which is adjacent to Sadov, but does a lot of the work of the Student Center, but it's now more of a gateway to the dark side, the South Campus that used to be Kirkland College for Women. When we were here, of course, it was an apple orchard, a place where the SIGs would occasionally go to dispose of a no longer usable car. I know you're out there. There are many more buildings today and more courses, some in academic disciplines that did not even exist then. The faculty is bigger and far more ethnically diverse, as is the student body. Of course, half of them are women. Many of them are of color. They come from dozens of countries in nearly every state in the Union, whereas we came mostly from New York and the surrounding states. And I hate to tell you guys, but they are, at least on paper, a lot smarter and more skilled than we were, with exceptions, of course. But then again, we had it tougher. We had distribution requirements. Unlike today's students with their open curriculum, we could not graduate without taking a science course, a quantitative course, mine was logic, and we had to demonstrate proficiency in a foreign language. Two requirements in particular stand out. Yes papers, the obligation to produce 2 essays, each grammatically, syntactically, and logically flawless in order to pass required freshman English. Yes papers were to Hamiltonians of our day what Paris Island is to a Marine. Unspeakably painful, but a necessary step if one was to be successful in life. The second was the 4-year public speaking requirement, another banner held high by Hamilton men, without which they will tell you they would have never gotten that first promotion or ever mustered the courage to propose to their wives. The reality was that after the first year and a half in which we practiced basic declamation and the rules of debate and parliamentary procedure, the utility of the courses faded a little bit. Take discussion, for example. I took that either second semester sophomore or first semester junior year from Leif for Lafayette Todd, a debonair, chain-smoking former advertising executive who gathered us twice a week to, well, talk. I don't mean to denigrate the public speaking tradition. After all, in February of our sophomore year, the college's debate team lost out to a team from Harvard in the finals of a McGill University International Debating Tournament in Montreal. So close and exciting was the Hamilton-Harvard Championship debate, it was reported, that McGill University and the Canadian Broadcasting System decided to sponsor a return match between the two teams. Beyond curricular requirements, academics were rigorous. Generally speaking, institutions of higher learning were less forgiving then. The college grade point average was around a C. In recent years, it's more like a B+. We had classes 6 days a week. Chuck Beach tells of one semester in which he had 6 8 a.m. classes. And most professors were not interested in bolstering their student approval ratings by handing out soft grades. It was somewhat Darwinian, and having a high retention rate was not a measure of excellence as it is now considered thanks to U.S. News and World Report's ranking system. Peter Chapin and Perry Stafford were once called into French professor Franklin Hamlin's office freshman year and presented with a number representing a grade on the most recent quiz. It was a number in the mid to high 50s. Both Perry and Peter recognized a failing grade, but took comfort in the fact that it was close to a passing 60. Professor Hamlin leaned forward. "Messieurs," he said, "you do not understand. This number is your 2 grades added together." And still they do not pass. Many of our teachers, a few of the men, had distinct personalities and often nicknames. Public speaking professor Robert Mumbles Carson, Digger Graves, Tweedy Gams. Some were outright characters. Robert Barnes, Bobo Rudd, accomplished poet as well as a beloved English professor, retired by the time we got here, but still a presence on campus. Bobo was known to ride his horse from fraternity to fraternity during house party weekends. He was also once quoted in a Spectator profile apologizing for the clutter of books in his house. "Sometimes," he said, "I have trouble finding a place to have a drink around here." Then there was Sidney Werdemer, professor of economics, but to us, the all-knowing, all-seeing dean of students. The 90-pound hummingbird, knew who you were before your first bed was made up in Dunham, who allegedly had a spy network of students that allowed him to shut down a raucous party before it got raucous, who knew exactly who flushed and ignited M80 down the toilet in Dunham within minutes of the explosion. Homeland Security could have used him. In addition to teaching art slides, the class was known as Darkness at Noon, Paul Parker was one of the most sophisticated faculty members on campus. Not only did he know his art, he also played serious jazz piano. Mostly, he will remain dear to me for his description of the village of Clinton, cited in previous Annalist letters as the Versailles of Utica. Now there is a man with a sense of humor. Edwin Barrett would entertain students in his Shakespeare class by playing multiple parts in a one-man thespian tour de force. Students would sit mesmerized as Professor Barrett metamorphosed seamlessly from Hamlet, I loved you not, to Ophelia, I was the more deceived, back to Hamlet, get thee to a nunnery. And he did this all from memory. John Lowe Baldwin, in his tenure as choir director that ended abruptly at the end of our first year, produced a men's chorus as good as any college in the country. The Hamilton College Choir appeared on CBS TV during a Christmas tour in New York City our first year here. If you sang for John, you worked your butt off. John Titler describes Kenneth Jablon as a pipe-smoking, roly-poly man, jovial and affable, in addition to ably teaching his students the fundamentals in Spanish language, literature, and culture, recalls John. He and his wife invited us repeatedly to dinner at their home and chaperone parties at the Teak House. Personal relationships with faculty were a hallmark of Hamilton then. Art Jones recalls missing not one but two final exams in Professor Freddie Grant's organic chemistry class. The first because he simply overslept. The second, which had been generously rescheduled by Professor Grant, this time because he'd been lured into a road trip to Skidmore, where he drank scotch and didn't return to campus until 2 hours after he was supposed to have taken the exam. Grant, the fact that Art refers to him as Freddie, tells you something about their relationship, lectured him sternly but gave him a D instead of an F. When Art interviewed at Yale Medical School and got in part because of the interviewer saw that he had learned Freddie Grant's lesson and probably knew who Freddie Grant was. These relationships had consequences. Often, all it took was a phone call from Dean Tolles, and you were in at Cornell Law School, or one from Sid Werdemer that landed you a place at the Harvard Business School. Athletics played a large role in our lives, not because we were particularly good, but because in a college of around 800, a large percentage of us were needed to fill the rosters of the football, soccer, cross country, ice hockey, swimming, basketball, lacrosse, baseball, track, tennis, and golf teams. Coaches tend to be characters in themselves. Don Jones, a decorated B-24 bombardier who flew over 100 missions in World War II, coached football and freshman basketball. Jim Vaughn says he was often designated by Jones as the freshman basketball captain because at the start of the game, when the refs asked him to designate a captain, Jones would tell them, I don't know any of their names, just get the funny-looking little one with the glasses. Bob Cady remembers a football game against Wagner on Staten Island. We were behind something like 40-6 when I caught a pass with about a minute to go in the game, Bob recounts. I looked up at Jones from the ground and said, Coach, should I call a timeout? He was stunned. His jaw dropped and he yelled back, call timeout? Hell no, Cady. Let's get out of here before somebody gets hurt. Those of us who played hockey against Cornell can understand that sentiment. Speaking of hockey, Greg Bott was legendary as a player, both at Colgate and for years with the Clinton Comets of the Eastern Hockey League, where he held the scoring title even though he only played home games. As a coach, he taught by example. Greg would challenge us alone or in pairs or even threes to knock him off his feet. We could not. John Titler tells the story of an away tennis match somewhere in New York State. The team was so small that we did not merit a bus, says John. Coach Max Weber drove some of the players in his station wagon, while Fred Vanderbilt drove the rest. In his mid to late 20s already, Fred was married, had played in the U.S. national championships at Forest Hills, and smoked like a chimney. As we were departing from campus and Coach Weber was reminding Fred of the route we would take, I watched from the back seat how Fred, with his right hand, covered up the ashtray, mounded with cigarette butts. It should be noted, however, that under Coach Weber and Captain Ken Wyatt, the tennis team went undefeated for 3 consecutive seasons. Then there was Manfred von Schiller. Varsity, soccer, lacrosse, and freshman hockey coach. The last, I guess, because there wasn't anybody else to do it, as he could hardly stand up in his skates. I could devote an entire talk to the sayings of Coach Von Coach, but we don't have that much time. Those of us who played for him remember being told to line up on the corners of the circle or to pair up in threes. The one that tickles me the most to this day was a chalk talk he once gave to the lacrosse team, in which he drew up options for a fast break. His eyes widened with enthusiasm as the stub of chalk raced across the blackboard, illustrating a rich variety of plays available with a man open, so that the blackboard eventually came to look like a plate of fettuccine. There were, Coach Von Coach summarized, thousands, maybe hundreds of things you could do. We had our share of talented athletes. Tom Dial, who came to Hamilton as the New York State High School shot put champion, could, as Bill Honeycutt remembers, bench press a small truck. So too, as I recall, could my hockey teammate Jim Mote, who was in the act of bench pressing 300-some pounds when the great blackout of 1965 suddenly plunged the weight room, along with the entire Northeast, into darkness. Jim had the presence of mind to recognize that he personally had not blacked out and was able to lower the weight harmlessly back into the rack. Many of us remember Jack Bromley throwing a snowball from one side of Dunham Courtyard to the other on a rope, as they say in football, before it smashed into some unfortunate classmate. Jack went on to Ithaca College, where he set a number of pitching records and led their baseball team to the semifinals of the NCAA championship. He is, claims Bill Honeycutt, the only pitcher in any league who struck out Minnesota Twins All-Star batting champion Rod Carew 4 times in one game. As they say, look it up. But enough about athletics and academics. We know what we really came here for was the social life. Okay, we didn't have any. Or we had very little that didn't involve hundreds of miles of travel, burning vast amounts of 35-cent a gallon gasoline in often unsuccessful quests to find meaningful female companionship at Skidmore, Wells, Vassar, Smith, and more locally, Cas, that is, Cazenovia Junior College. Only 3 times a year was there anything that could be construed as social life here on the Hill, house party weekends. Sid Ahern has affixed images in his mind of a veritable convoy of Utica Club trucks winding its way up College Hill Road on the Friday of each of those weekends. House parties were ritualistic affairs. The women stayed in the fraternity houses while the men slept elsewhere, most of the time. Couples whose relationships had, shall we say, matured, tended to stay together at one of the many local motels, the Cloverleaf, the Pinecrest, the less than luxurious Limberlost cabins come to mind. Leading up to winter house parties our sophomore year, Dr. Leon Rowe, the college physician, opined, and I quote from an article in The Spectator, "I consider it unsportsmanlike and ungentlemanly to get a date so intoxicated that she loses her sense of responsibility," unquote. Such behavior on today's college campuses, Dr. Rowe would learn if he were still with us, would not only be considered unsportsmanlike, but flat out illegal. There were Friday night parties and sports events to attend on Saturday. On Saturday night, there was always a big band in the hockey rink or sometimes here in the chapel. In this regard, Hamilton punched well above its weight, with performances by the likes of Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, Little Richard, Smokey Robinson and the Miracle, and Simon and Garfunkel. Before coming here for one spring house party, a member of the Ronettes, making a return engagement on the Hill, said in an interview that performing at Hamilton was really no more dangerous than at any Air Force or Navy base. Sunday mornings drew lesser bands to accompany gin and juice parties that dragged into the afternoon, leaving everyone exhausted and women racing back to their campuses by any means of transportation possible to get a shower and a clean set of clothes. Back on College Hill, there was always a story of someone discovered a day or two later, passed out behind a couch or rolled up in a rug. The venue for all this bacchanalia were the fraternities. There were 11 of them when we were here, each with its own house, each with its own personality. Deeks and Sayus were jocks who drank too much. The DUs were farmers. AD was the preppy house. The intellectuals gravitated to the downhill houses, Teak, Griffin, and DeFi or ELS. And then there were the SIGs, self-described as thugs with savoir-faire. Every year, between 80 and 90% of students joined one or another of these fraternities, and for those who didn't receive a bid but still wanted to belong, there was the Total Opportunity Program, otherwise known as the Turkey Pool. After formal rush, the unbidden were then divvied up discreetly among the houses. At the time, it seemed like some to an earnest attempt at egalitarianism. To others, it was transparently demeaning. Marty Benninger, writing in The Spectator, called the system, quote, hopelessly inadequate, unfair, and self-defeating. But that's just the way things were done. I will not relitigate the 1995 residential life decision that shut down the fraternity houses. Many of you know that as a trustee, I was involved in that decision. Suffice it to say that when we were here in an all-male environment, the fraternity houses provided room and board to their members, as well as a place to party. They tended to be a bit shabby, but they managed to maintain the essential trappings of home. Over the decades since we graduated, however, the kitchens closed, the furniture disappeared from the living and dining rooms, and the responsibility of maintaining some sense of domesticity withered and died. By the early 90s, in one house at least, there was not a single functioning doorknob. Of course, we were all long gone by then, out in the world pursuing careers, raising families, fixing broken appliances, instead of throwing them out of the window at 4 a.m. Our memories are generally fond. We form friendships that remain strong. Students today, both men and women, still form strong friendships, even marriages, just not in the same social construct. To those who still grieve the loss of fraternity life we knew and enjoyed, I say let's move on. Ironically, fraternities provided us with some degree of cultural exposure. From time to time, faculty members and their wives came to dinner, prompting us to dress up a bit, and for an evening anyway, act like adults. We saw live demonstrations of people having 1 or 2 drinks and stop. Students today, closeted by the 21-year-old drinking age, don't have that opportunity. We had been forewarned that civility was a fragile gift in what was essentially a free world. Our freshman orientation consisted of reading William Goldman's Lord of the Flies during the summer before matriculating. As you will recall, the book is about a group of English schoolboys marooned without any adult supervision on a deserted island. In frighteningly little time, most of the trappings of civility fell away as these British boys devolved into primitive pagans. In our respective lounges, under the guidance of our Dunham advisors, we talked about the possibility of such a dystopian future here at Hamilton. The not-so-subtle message was that in our similarly isolated and primitive world, this could happen to us. We hardly expected that our world order would be profoundly shaken from well outside College Hill when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated late in our first semester freshman year. I suspect every one of you remembers precisely where you were on this campus when you heard that news. On a lighter note, there's a story that will not die about a dinner at the home of Professor Wertimer, which, if true, lends substance to this theory. A couple of months into that first semester, some half a dozen freshmen were invited to the Wertimer's College Hill Roadhouse for the laudable purpose of getting to know faculty and students to know each other as people, as Sidney used to say. As the story goes, one of the guests, apparently forgetting that he was no longer in Commons, asked if someone would pass the expletive-deleted peas. A pall of silence fell over the table. To the rescue came the bow-tied professor, who broke the tension by turning to his wife and saying cheerfully, "You heard the young man, Ellie, pass the expletive-deleted peas." Over the years, I have doggedly attempted to verify this story. One classmate, who is not with us this weekend, I'm afraid, swears that he was at the table and heard the exchange with his own ears. Ellie Wertimer, to her dying day, which was only a few years ago, vigorously denied this story. Sydney, she would say with indignation, would never use that word to her. I was unable to get Ellie to see that the story, true or not, was meant to be a compliment to her husband for his ice-breaking skills. People think of the 60s as a period of campus activism. True, the free speech movement was born at Berkeley in 1964, and the civil rights movement drew students, including some from Hamilton, to the South. Opposition to the war in Vietnam was only beginning to build. This campus was hardly a hotbed of student activism. We did make our mark on two local issues. Hans Sieberts recalls an attempt by the sophomores above us to enforce the hoary tradition of freshman beanies. We refused. The sophomores then tried to block the entrance to Commons, declaring that we wouldn't eat until we wore the beanies. There were more of us than there were them, and we had Hans. The blockade broke, we ate, the beanies vanished forever. The second tradition we challenged was required attendance at Sunday religious services, a defining element of Presbyterian Hamilton since its founding. In our first semester here, 150 students, led by our own Dan Siegel, conducted a sit-in on the steps of this building. The following spring, the Board of Trustees abolished compulsory chapel. The next fall, Dean of the chapel, Colin Miller, whose fire and brimstone rhetoric came straight out of central casting, held what he promoted as, and I quote, "the first service in the history of Hamilton College offered purely for the glory of God and not to fulfill a graduation requirement." Now there's a spinmeister. Despite our isolation, the steady stream of politicians, statesmen, artists, and the occasional scoundrel managed to stop by Clinton, New York, and speak to us. M. Stanton Evans, editor of the Indianapolis Star, and a leading conservative voice, spoke in the Minor Theater about conservatism and freedom. The Spectator scored interviews with two candidates for mayor of New York City, John Lindsay and William F. Buckley, Jr. Robert F. Kennedy spoke here. Senator Jake Javits, a moderate Republican, certainly by modern standards, was here, as was John Rousselot, PR director for the staunchly anti-communist John Birch Society. Liberal or conservative, all spoke without incident. No visiting speaker carried more risk of serious protest, if not violence, than American Nazi Party leader George Lincoln Rockwell. He spoke here in the winter of our senior year at the invitation of the student-run Root Jessup Public Affairs Council. His white supremacist, anti-Semitic, racist message was well known to all of us in advance, but many of us went to hear him anyway. Mike Sorrell remembers finding Rockwell's argument that Jews presented an imminent danger to America rather compelling, until Mike remembered that he himself was Jewish. I had witnessed evil in its most persuasive form, recalls Mike. Hamilton College, by allowing me the opportunity to hear someone I would usually avoid, taught me both the potential harm of oratory and the importance of knowing thine enemy. In turn, I have taught these lessons to my children. We often debated politics among ourselves, not from behind a smartphone screen, but face to face. It's amazing what you can learn in a conversation by watching the faces of the people you're talking to. A little blush of anger here, a smile of appreciation there, a skeptically furrowed brow. I didn't fully appreciate how much one could learn until I began to see how unskilled members of recent generations, and frankly all of us, have become in basic interpersonal communication, the art of conversation. Maybe Hamilton could now use that course in discussion. Communications technology in our day consisted of a payphone at the end of the corridor and a TV set in the lounge. Without computers, Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, or the anonymous Yik Yak, information, ideas, emotions, opinions were shared up close and personal. It could be slow and awkward, but it was effective. I don't mean to suggest that we didn't also fire salvos at one another. We did so then through various campus publications. When it came to criticism of our peers, we seldom held back. Critical, sometimes scathing reviews of the Hamiltonian or something in the pages of the Continental Literary magazine were regular features in the pages of the Spectator. The paper turned its editorial ire on the staff of the Hamiltonian yearbook for the class of 1964, describing it as, quote, a product of mismanagement, myopia, and misrepresentation, adding, nevertheless, an improvement over Hamiltonians of past years. Even faculty members openly critiqued what students published, responding to John Gordon's debut Spectator column, The Jaundiced Eye. History professor David Ellis fired off a letter to the paper. Quote, the fulminations of Mr. Gordon are the worst example of bad taste that I have seen in 18 years at this college, he wrote. Undaunted, John continued to produce the column all the way through senior year. Sometimes culture seeped in by osmosis. Chuck Rinker recalls walking to dinner after a March swim practice before a big meet. When I approached the chapel, whose doors were open despite the cold, recalls Chuck, the Paul Kuntz Chamber Orchestra was rehearsing for a weekend concert. I was brought up short by some of the most beautiful music I had ever heard. As I stood shivering but transfixed, light jacket, no gloves, wind blowing up my jeans on my freshly shaven legs, I couldn't pull myself away until I found out what they were playing. When they finished, I slipped in and snatched a program. He later learned that the composer of Adagio for Strings was 20th century American Samuel Barber. To this day, whenever he hears that haunting work, Chuck says, I think of that magical night and all of the discoveries I made during my days at Hamilton. There were 62 names and faces in the Meet the Freshmen Facebook issued on our arrival in September 1963 that were not among the names of the degree recipients in June of 1967. On the other hand, there were 19 men who received degrees with us who did not start out with us in 1963. Some of those who fell by the wayside, like Peter Chapin and Morgan McKenzie, returned to receive their degrees later, just as there were some who had received degrees with us who had started college earlier, left and come back, men like Henry Allen, Jim Wilsey, and Fred Vanderbilt. Still others left and never returned, either because Hamilton wasn't right for them, or right at the time, or in some cases because they never had the chance. Keith Althouse was a poet and an artist with a fertile mind who came and left Hamilton again, but went on to become an accomplished poet. His work has appeared in the New Yorker, Poetry Magazine, Orion, American Poetry Review, Harvard Review, Virginia Quarterly, and elsewhere. Chuck Waddell flunked out at the end of sophomore year, joined the Army, and became a decorated Green Beret officer. After his discharge, he was admitted to Harvard, from which he graduated, I think, even with honors. He now runs a search firm outside of Chicago. Perry Stafford's pre-medical career at Hamilton seemed doomed from the start, as he found that 8 a.m. Saturday morning chem labs were not compatible with his social life. Perry was sent packing in the middle of his senior year as a quote-unquote underachieving government major. He enlisted in the Marines, graduated at the top of his OCS class, became a carrier-certified combat pilot, finished up his pre-med and medical school at the University of Florida, and paid for it with 14 additional years as a Navy surgeon. Perry retired as a full captain. He became an internationally respected pediatric surgeon with a curriculum vitae that lists over 100 peer-reviewed articles. At the renowned Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, he was a full professor of surgery and pediatrics and ran his own division. Ken, AKA Hangover Hearst, always seemed to have a book in his hand, though hardly ever a textbook. He hitchhiked to Washington, D.C. during freshman year to attend JFK's funeral. He left Hamilton and joined the Marines. On May 13, 1967, 3 weeks and a day before the rest of us graduated, Ken was shot dead when his unit was ambushed in Quang Tri. We will have the chance to honor Ken and a long list of other classmates who have passed away at tomorrow morning's memorial service here at the chapel. There are others who drifted away over the 4 years. Conway Wilson Young, who came to Hamilton from Eton College, the renowned British School of Kings. Lindsay Shefflin, who was the nephew of New York's glamorous mayor, John Lindsay. Hugh Kincannon, Chipsapola. Where are they now? They are somehow with us today, I suspect, part of a small company of boys who were attracted to this windswept hillside by something. Whether it was the tradition, the no-nonsense classroom rigor, or the uncomplicated, sometimes monastic quest to know thyself, as the college motto urges. Many former class analysts have succumbed to the temptation to end their letters with the last line of the original version of Carissima. You know, we still will be thy boys. But I know that if I did that, I'd choke up, and then Rick Leavenworth would start to cry. and it would get all soppy and, frankly, a little trite. So let's just leave it at this. We came, we learned, we left. We have come back again, different from one another, different from what we were then, but forever marked by this place.